If you want to learn how to take a patch in your garden from nothing and convert it into a thriving wildflower meadow, then be sure to keep watching. I'm a zoologist, and while I tend to focus my research on animals that are in quite remote locations, recently I've been embarking on projects to help bring animals closer to home. One of the best ways to do that is to create a wildflower meadow. Some of you may remember the big storm that blew my greenhouse away, leaving a wooden frame behind. After breaking up the frame, I was left with this patch of gravel. Most of my garden is concreted, so I thought that this part would be too, but I lucked out and found soil underneath the layers of landscaping fabric. So my mission to create a meadow here has begun. There are two different types of wildflowers, the annuals and the perennials. Annual wildflowers tend to bloom for much longer over the year, but they die out as soon as the cold hits, which means if you want to keep them around in your meadow, you either need to rely on them being able to self-seed and start germinating again, or you need to resow your meadow each year. Perennial wildflowers don't last as long, however they keep coming back year on year. They do take a little bit more time to establish, so they usually don't start blooming until the second year of your wildflower meadow, or even beyond that. I wanted a perennial meadow because they tend to support higher biodiversity, but I didn't want to risk grass establishing in that first year and outcompeting any of the young perennials that are trying to bloom next year. So I went for a seed mix. I included the usual annual species of a corn meadow, which are corncockle, cornflower, corn chamomile, corn poppy and corn marigold. But I also included a variety of native UK perennial mixes. The idea is that the corn meadow can establish itself in the first year, helping wildlife straight away and preventing grasses from taking over. Then it'll die back and allow the perennials to establish from next year onwards. Usually it's recommended to sow in the autumn to allow seeds to go through a cold period which will trigger them to come back in spring. However, I want to try establishing this straight away. So in March, I planted out some seeds in little trays and left them in my greenhouse area to hopefully establish. While those seeds were preparing to germinate, I had a big task on my hands. Remember all that gravel? Well, it's not going to be much use to a wildflower meadow, so it was time to get rid of it. This meant shoveling and shoveling and shoveling. Lots and lots and lots of spades full of gravel. There were points in this process that I thought it was never going to end. Putting in the work to prepare the ground properly now meant that I wouldn't have to redo any of this in the future, so I kept at it. This included removing things like old flower pots that must have been buried there long ago. How you prepare your ground for a meadow really depends on what you have in the first place. If you're working with an area of established grass, you'll go through much the same process as I am with the gravel. Remove the top 3 to 6 inches of soil to get rid of the grasses and the rich nutrients. Then till it to create a fine soil and cover it to prevent any hardy plants like thistles from taking hold until it's ready to be seeded. There was something like 600 litres of gravel once I'd got done taking it all up. It's now spread out all across Northern Ireland, laying the base for other people's garden projects. Now it was time for me to get this meadow looking like a meadow. While not a necessary step, I wanted to add a border as a way to improve the look of the space during those lower growth months and to mark the borders in case I do any future projects outside of this space. The hardest part of this was digging down into the heavily compacted clay to actually get it buried and stable. Once that was in, it was time to add some extra soil. This step is heavily dependent on the type of soil that you already have. Clay can be very nutrient rich. However, it spent years and years being packed down by heavy gravel and by a greenhouse on top of it. So it was very dense, and it was going to be hard for any of the young plants trying to germinate to access any of those nutrients at all. So I actually added some compost. This gave the right texture and just enough nutrients that wildflowers would be able to establish. The plan from here is to just never fertilise the patch and let the nutrients naturally cycle out to support the perennial wildflowers that prefer a lower nutrition soil and to prevent higher nutrient requiring grasses from taking over. Then I decided to scatter some seeds. I wanted to test whether the seeds in my greenhouse or the seeds left to naturally take hold would grow better. Wildflower meadows only need a thin coverage of scattered seeds, and then for you to gently walk over the soil to press them into it. Then you just need to keep it well watered until it's established enough that the plants can manage their own water retention. Then it's a case of waiting and hoping that the seed stock that you used is of good quality. Looks like mine was, because just a week later, the very first little plants had germinated. 4 days later, towards the end of April, many more had joined them. And then my gutters fell down, which meant I had to get some workmen in to replace them, and so my poor meadow got very stomped on. I thought that this damage and chemical spray would mean the end for my meadow before it had even begun, so this was a sad sight. The seeds that I planted in containers weeks beforehand had started sprouting as well though, so I didn't give up. And my little disaster didn't stop the birds from enjoying the space. Often it's recommended to cover a meadow with netting initially, so that the birds don't eat all the seeds. However, this was all a test to see what was going to happen, so I let the birds do as they wished. They get fed elsewhere in my garden up high anyway, so they don't need to come down here to eat my seeds. And this was actually one of the few times I'd ever seen them come to this part of the garden, so rather than be frustrated, I was actually excited that the birds were making use of this new space. I let the whole thing sit for about a month, with a bit of watering being my only interference. A lot of nature-related projects require just some patience rather than constant tinkering. The wait was good because a month later the seed mix that I'd planted in trays was looking strong. Not only that, but the guttering disaster wasn't the end for the sown sections of the meadow either. Some of the plants hadn't just survived, they'd actually overtaken the tray mixes in growth. It was at this point that I decided to switch strategies. If the plants growing out in the meadow were doing so well, then I wanted my tray plants to take advantage of that too. This coincided with 30 Days Wild, which was the challenge that I recently completed, where I was filming myself doing an act related to wildlife every single day during June. The playlist is on my channel if you haven't seen it yet. It should provide you with a lot of inspiration for different garden-related projects you can do, as well as different ways you can get out and about to connect with nature, alongside establishing a wildflower meadow. June saw the meadow starting to attract a few of the small invertebrates, as well as the birds that were foraging instead of having a dust bath. I wasn't worried at all at this point, with how well established my meadow plants were starting to become. If the birds picked up a few seeds that were still left over, that was just a part of nature anyway. In mid-June, I saw my first flower blooming. This is a cornflower, one of those corn meadow annual species that I mentioned earlier. I use apps and guidebooks to identify flowers, and then I go away and do a bit of extra research on them. This is the photo that I took to identify the cornflower. Although it is native here, it is rare in the wild thanks to a result of agricultural intensification, which has reduced its population. It's an annual species, so although there are a lot of them getting ready to bloom this year, I'm not expecting them to come back year on year. So I'm just going to appreciate them while they're here now. There were plenty of other species also preparing to bloom, but until they did, I wasn't going to be able to identify them accurately. As I've said, I'm a zoologist, not a botanist. Although I'm trying hard to learn my plant identification, there's just so much to learn, and I rely heavily on apps and guidebooks to help me. A few days later, I saw the first butterfly that I've ever seen in my garden, and it was right above my meadow. This small tortoiseshell was only here for a moment, but it was a sign of more to come. If you're enjoying watching the progress of my meadow as it establishes itself and starts to attract wildlife, then make sure to click the subscribe button. It really helps me out, and it means that you'll be kept up to date as I release different videos in the future about all sorts of wildlife related topics. Another few days and the first bees had discovered my meadow. These tree bumblebees got straight to work feasting on the cornflowers. They were joined by a solitary bee, which I still haven't figured out the identification of, but my best guess is it's some sort of leafcutter species. Other invertebrates were finding the now shaded soil area, such as this little spider. At the end of June, a few more flowers started blooming. These are coriander, chamomile, and cowherb. Coriander isn't native here, and it's an annual plant, so hopefully this will be the only year that it grows. My best guess for how it got here is that either it was carried along as a seed in some bird droppings, or perhaps it was used by the previous owner when they were using the greenhouse, and some seeds got dropped and they've just been waiting ever since for the right conditions to establish themselves. Corn chamomile is a native species. My app actually identified this as the American chamomile. However, that species is supposed to have felt-like hairs underneath its leaves, which my plant doesn't have. So I think it's actually the native species that's come from one of my wildflower seed mixes. This is an annual plant, which means that it would be found in those annual meadows alongside things like cornflowers. I know that it's not an oxeye daisy, even though it looks very similar to that, because oxeye daisies would have petals that overlap, whereas this one has them distinct. The cowherb is another species that isn't native. It tends to just crop up as it was introduced here and isn't very good at persisting. It's often killed off by the first frost, which means that any that do crop up just tend to be incidental. This either came from one of my seed mixes accidentally, or it was another one that was just waiting in the clay soil, ready for the conditions to be right. Then I started another huge garden project, which I'll talk to you about in a future video. However, it did create a lot of mess. The workmen tried to be respectful of my meadow, but it did get quite a bit trampled on the borders. Partway through the cleanup, I filmed a little bit just to show you how full the meadow was by this point. It took 2 months from seeing the first seeds starting to peek out of the soil to getting this much coverage. Plants really are impressive with how quickly they can establish in an area. It always amazes me just how resilient nature can be. That's the second disaster event in 2 months that this meadow has faced, and it's still okay. Much like in the wild, when there would be grazers passing through or the occasional wildfire, plants can get damaged and then come back. They might be a little worse for wear initially, but they really are able to just spring back and carry on growing healthily. After only 4 days, the meadow was looking back to full health, and some new flowers were blooming. This is corncockle, another of those corn meadow annuals. Corncockles are a very rare annual flower in the wild. They were originally introduced here, but they have been here for so long that some people consider them to be native. They don't get their seeds eaten by birds, and the seeds are too heavy to be spread by the wind, which means they are fully reliant on self-seeding the direct area around them. This means that for incidental occurrences like this one here, it's quite difficult to get them to establish themselves in the following years. With the onset of a heat wave, some of the plants were starting to struggle a bit. I did do a light watering to make sure they continued to establish, but otherwise I let the meadow sort itself out. So long as the majority of plants look healthy, it's perfectly natural for a few to die out early on. And I've got quite a few new species coming through. Ribwort plantain flowers from April to October. These seed heads lasting for so long means that they can provide birds with food sources during the winter. These are a native perennial species, which means they're supposed to be here and they should come back year on year. You're probably familiar with the dandelion, which is a native perennial flower that keeps consistently coming back year on year. I've made videos in the past talking about how dandelions can be really beneficial for UK wildlife. And in particular, I made one recently that was looking at how the seed heads attracted linnets to my garden for the first time. American willowherb was introduced here over 100 years ago. They grow and spread really fast, and they're a perennial species, so once they're established, they'll just keep coming back. I've been fighting this species for years and years from trying to grow through my greenhouse floor, so I know for a fact that it was already here. I've been pulling them up by their roots because they are covering my garden, and if I don't manage them, they're just going to take over all of my flower species. Corn marigolds aren't native either, but they were introduced such a long time ago, back when grain was first brought over. They used to be super abundant, but they suffered the same losses that other corn meadow species did due to intensifying agriculture. This species is another annual species, which means that it's just establishing the area, getting it ready for my perennial flowers to come through next year and onwards. So far, I've seen a single long-headed poppy in the meadow. It's a native species, but it's annual. so it'll probably be the only one that I see here. The yarrow that's about to bloom here is a native wildflower and a perennial, which means it's probably going to establish itself as a common feature of my meadow over the coming years. This species looks very similar to coriander. However, if you look close enough, you can tell it apart by slightly different flower heads. My identification app says that these leaves are part of the common mallow, which blooms into bright pink flowers. That means that over the coming years, alongside the white flowers of the yarrow, I'll be seeing bright pink tufts as well. This was identified as woodruff, which is another native perennial. It blooms into these little white flowers, but because it's typically a woodland plant species, it will probably only thrive in areas under the shade of other flowers within the meadow. Smooth sow thistle is another native species, but it's annual, which means that it relies on self-seeding rather than being able to come back in the same spot year on year. However, this species is common in the area that I live, and I've actually seen it growing in this location of my garden ever since I moved in, so I am expecting to see it here again next year. Towards the end of July, I can really say that the wildflower meadow has become well developed. All of those different plant species that I've talked about in this video, the pollinator species like bumblebees, solitary bees, and hoverflies, all of the invertebrates like spiders down below, the butterflies up above like small tortoiseshell and admiral, as well as my garden birds foraging in the area. It really has become the haven for wildlife that I hoped that area could turn into. Wildflower meadows are ever-changing things. Next year I expect even more perennial species to replace the annuals here, so it will look completely different. But the goal is to attract wildlife, so hopefully it will keep doing that. The meadow will also need maintenance, with a few cutbacks over the year. However, I'm going to discuss that and show it to you in a future video. For now, I'm going to go outside and enjoy my meadow. Let me know in the comments if you've done a similar project like this in your own garden and how it changed over the years.